Very good. Why don't we call our meeting to order?
Recording in progress.
Councilmember Kelly?
Here.
Committee Member McMillan? Councilmember Nguyen? Councilmember Nusma?
Here.
Committee Member Rikus?
Here.
And Chair Livingston.
Here. All right, so we have a quorum? Very good. All right, so we'll open it up to public comment. I'd like to say something. I'm sure you would. All right, start with Jack. Mr. Martell, please.
Thank you. Howdy. Well, I've given you all a packet. I've only got about a page and a half, what I'd like to say. So I'd like the courtesy to have the time to say it.
Okay, so maybe you think 5 minutes would do it? That's a little bit more. Why don't we get going, hopefully about 5 minutes? Okay. Just get going.
I'm an elected official. I'd like the courtesy, there's no one else really here, to have a chance
Please
to
proceed.
run through this.
We'll get through, okay.
Okay, you all got a packet in front of you. And, okay, my name is Jack Mortell. I want to speak about long-term real estate tax relief. I'm in my 70th year as an Evanstonian and an Evanston homeowner continuously since the late 70s. I'm a retired captain of the Evanston Fire Department and in my second term as an elected trustee of the Evanston Firefighters Pension Fund. The 29-page council requested Blue Ribbon report on Evanston's pensions was very clear that fully funding the pension each year is a sound management and budgeting practice, so that, and I'm quoting, Evanston citizens do not have to cause for concern about disruptive scrambles to fund or finance the city's pensions obligations in the future. This 29-page document goes into great detail on how to do it. And importantly, the committee, this is the quote again, committee strongly recommends that property tax increases should only be considered as a last resort after all other sources of revenue and budget cuts have been exhausted. And that's, so you can read further about this on the top takeaway sheet. This is the first page of the packet I handed out. Or see the Blue Ribbon report on the city's website. It's right like this. It's right on the pension board website, on the pension site. The second page of the packet is one solution for bridging toward full funding without raising taxes. This shows the amount of PPRT the state sent the city in 2022, and when that PPRT actually came into our coffers. It's a little over $5.5 million in 2022. I also added a link for everybody. This is where you go to find it. See, that's where you go to find it, and those are our numbers. Takes a little while. There's thousands of these. Takes a while to find it, but once you get in the rhythm of it, you can go back years and see how much we receive. Okay. There is a regularity to when the city receives this PPRT. It's always about 8 payments a year. So far this year, we've received 3 payments, totaling a little over $1.9 million already. There's 5 more payments to come. And isn't it odd? Excuse me. Too many papers, I apologize. I put it right in the packet. That's the third page. Isn't it odd that in 2022, only on the general fund revenues, only $600,000 was budgeted when it was $5.5 million. And this year it's only 2.25, and we're already at 1.9 with 5 payments left. I know I found that on the PPRT, they do give you a trigger, say it's going to be less next year, and they gave you a percentage. I don't have it with me, but I know when I did the figures, and this is a date right now, it's going to be around 4.3 million. Okay, you can actually find these things if you want to dig around and find them. It is predictable. Let's keep in mind that the Illinois Municipal League clearly states that PPRT was designed to provide a revenue source for local governments to meet pension obligations and pay outstanding debt. Now, there's another, this Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, they doubled down on that. They say personal property replacement tax each calendar year is for pension obligations of the local governmental unit. All pension obligations must be satisfied before the funds can be used for other purposes. This is a more recent document. They go further in the levy process. It's not, my little printer was starting to smoke. I couldn't get every document in there. But personal property replacement tax, levy process. Personal property replacement tax should be considered when preparing the annual property tax levy. The basic intent of the law is to prevent excessive taxation of real estate. Sound fiscal planning requires that all revenues, including personal property replacement tax receipts, be considered in the levy process. It is recommended that local governments make a determination of the funds at tax levy time. This is from the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. I'm about half done. And I wonder, after reading all this, has city staff been breaking the law all these years when the pension funds did not receive any of the PPRT for decades? For decades, never got a penny. And since 2016 through 2022, you'll see a spreadsheet on the last of your pages, the very last page. They did start giving it to PPRT to the pensions, these straight off of city budgets. We took in 15.8 million, and the pensions got about 4.2 million. I'd love to know where that other 11.5 went. Again, owing to these, I don't print these up. I'm just reading what the government's saying, okay?
You can make a judgment in the 23 budget as to the source of that, but there was an incremental $5 million contribution out of the general fund. Out of the general fund.
That's correct. I don't think I list 23 here.
No, you didn't, but I think there was a, some of that PPRT also came in after the end of the, after the end of the year. We're going to talk about
Fair
this
enough.
more.
Yep, fair enough.
We're going to talk about this more because I agree we need better visibility on a lot of revenue and expense lines, and that's some of what we're
Thank you.
going to address tonight.
And, but I don't want the PPRT issue to become a red herring. This whole thing stalls because we don't quite know what PPRT is going to. The Budget and Finance Committee can make a recommendation for full funding from the City Council, recognizing other solutions toward full funding that are staring us right in the face. The next 3 pages of the packet are City of Evanston memorandums regarding a request for a budget amendment ordinance for 2020, 2021, and 2022. And these are city government documents. Highlighted are the amounts of savings surplus reported to the City Council by the Chief Financial Officer for each of those years. Again, if you go to the last page, that's at the top of the page, I believe, whether it's right GAAP basis or cash basis, it's either 123 million or 128 million excess. I'm feeling a little bit overtaxed at this point. I think other people are too. And we can't find money to fully fund the pension? Hogwash. Let's keep in mind also,
Maybe one more minute, Jack, okay? Maybe finish it up.
I've got 4 paragraphs. There's no one else here. I'd like to be heard. Let's also keep in mind that saving surplus money should not be confused with reserves that are held in various percentages in at least 10 other City of Evanston funds besides the general fund. We know how much is in there. What's in the other ones? And I took this straight from the budget today. There's 10 other funds that have as much as, they say, a minimum of 25%. There's huge money in these funds. Does anyone up there know where it is or how much it is? I don't. We should know how much we have in total reserves. Finally, I want to address how the fully funding pension amounts are determined each budget year. The documentation can be found on the City of Evanston's website pension page. Foster and Foster are the actuaries and consultants hired jointly by the city and the police and fire pension funds. If you're working with them right now, I'd actually like, because we pay for them too, I'd like to know what you're working, I'd like to be copied on what you're working on. There are actuaries also. Just almost done. Back to long-term real estate tax relief. There's only one true path, and that is following the Evanston's own Blue Ribbon Report and pensions and Foster's and Falker's recommendations for 100% funding of police and fire pensions. So plainly speaking, I'm asking this committee to move forward with great haste to recommend the 100% funding of police and fire pensions, not just for 2024, but until 2040. This dance is getting old. The current and especially the future real taxpayers of Evanston deserve this burden lifted off their back. The time to do that is right now. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Okay, sure.
Evening, everybody. I'm Dave Ellis. I'm going to just follow up a little bit on Jack's comments. I thought he did a very articulate job. I'd just like, again, to suggest that you fully fund the police and fire pension funds. The way I look at it, I'm a shareholder in the city of Evanston. You know, I've been here a long time. I pay taxes. I'm vested. The city's financial health directly affects my financial health. There's no separation, and I'm not going anywhere. It also affects every citizen and every taxpayer's financial health, real estate values, tax base, and all. To waste if we don't fully fund the pension funds, we're wasting tens of millions of dollars that we don't need to on underfunding. In the interest rate, as I said the last time I commented, it's about $50,000 a day. It's not fiscally responsible. I mean, that's money that we're paying that we're not getting anything for. As a shareholder, if I'm paying $50,000 a day, I don't have a problem. If we're making $100,000 a day, that'd be great. But we're not getting anything for that money. So I think the council needs to vote to fully fund the pension, as Mr. Mortel said, to 2040, to get this liability off our backs. As I mentioned before, it could be upward of $1 billion. Your comment on transparency is 100% correct. People understand what's going on. It's not a good forecast. It's not responsible. As the council members, you're trustees of the city's health. And when you take an oath of office, it's to maintain the city's health and well-being. As the last 40 years we've pushed this can down the road, it's gotten worse. I'm very proud of last year's council that was able to start turning the ship in the right direction. That was the first step. I think we need a policy to fully fund it going forward, and at least to be transparent about what our liabilities are, where we're at today, where we're at next year, 5 years, so on, with the actuaries and with the pension funds. That's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you very much. All right. So next point is approval of the minutes from the last meeting. Anyone have any comments on the minutes that were posted?
I will move approval of the minutes from our April 11th meeting.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, we do have a second.
Second.
We'll vote on it.
Councilmember Kelly?
Aye.
Committee Member McMillan?
Aye.
Councilmember Nguyen?
Aye.
Councilmember Nuzma?
Aye.
Chair Livingston?
Aye.
And Committee Member Rikus?
Aye.
Okay.
Sorry, Councilmember Reed is on the phone or on Zoom.
And Councilmember Reed?
Aye.
Very good. So they're approved. Okay, so we said in our last meeting we were going to focus our discussion tonight on three topics. One was to go over, I think, again, but look at sort of the final numbers of the difference between the projections for 22 and the final numbers for 22, because there's a lot of learning there. I think to Mr. Martel's point, there were some higher revenue numbers. Primarily, it was revenue that came in sort of late in the year or early in 23. So we'll talk about that, as well as now that we're a few months in and in light of the additional revenues that we saw with respect to 22, what's our best current view on 23? And then we will get into this pension discussion where I think everyone is saying the same thing. It's a matter of how we document it. So, Clayton, Mr. Black, if you could take us through the first page, which would be the comparison of the October projection to the current view on the final general fund position for 22.
Sounds good. So all of these slides are slides that you've seen over the last couple months. They've just been updated with the most recent information, as the chair said. So the first slide is an update from our April meeting where we talked about the general fund projected surplus for fiscal year 22. Getting closer to final numbers. Audit is still underway and ongoing and will be presented in its final form later this summer. But at least for now, we are looking at a $26 million surplus in the general fund for 22. I already talked about most of this in March, April. Was it March? March. But
Why wouldn't they be final if it's 2022?
so I will let Mr. Desai.
It is mostly final, but I cannot say it until the audit is over and becomes part of the audit report. But otherwise, yeah, number would pretty much stay there. But officially, I cannot say it's the final number.
So in terms of expenses, the general fund finished the year $1 million under budget, which is why the general fund wasn't included in the budget amendment that the city council approved last night. So overall expenses finished below budget. Most of this was due to salaries and vacancies. We've documented that and accounted for that in our FY23 budget to hopefully address that and make sure that our expense projections moving forward are a little bit closer. That being said, there's a number of other variables that we'll talk about that could impact those numbers. In terms of revenues, here are the top 8 in terms of variance with our original projection. You can see beyond these other 8, we were pretty close, only off by 15,000. But for these 8, there were some pretty big variances, most of this due to the fact that inflation continued throughout the winter months and into 2023, as far as we can tell, based on early returns. So sales taxes, real estate transfer taxes, PPRT, recreation program fees, one that we definitely needed to address this year. We raised fees for residents by 10% and for non-residents by another 30%. So a revenue that's bringing in quite a bit more than we budgeted, as well as building permits and GEMT revenue. So these are the kind of the top 8 impacting this larger than anticipated surplus in the general fund for 22.
One question. With regard, so 26.5 million is obviously much bigger than the 14.1 when we were figuring out the levy. Can you identify some areas? I know, for example, there was one PPRT payment that came in January, but what accounts for that huge, like, I don't, it's hard for me to believe that over 12 million came in January from our, so if you could just tell us why, how much of that, why so much of that wasn't presented to us during budget season?
Yeah, so the sum of these numbers here, these 8 revenues is 9.5 million. And then in expenses, we over budgeted what we thought we were going to spend in expenses by 3 million. So whenever you take that 9 on the revenue side plus the 3 on the expenses, you get that $12 million swing. So it's these 8 revenues and the expenses, which is mostly due to salaries and.
Right, but like, for example, I mean, like the PPRT was higher, in fact, in December than what you were telling us, because we could see from this really, and that link is great. Thank you, Mr. Martell, because it's not easy to find that website and find the number. But what I'm trying to ascertain is, we would like, it's for the taxpayers, for the residents, it's important that we have a better idea as to surplus. And there should be projections, like what prevented the finance department from having a better grasp on under budgeting by year end?
So-
Like, why, because in other words, I'm just saying, like, most of that revenue didn't come in after January 1st. Like, are you saying that amount really came in? I mean, I know it all didn't, because I know some of it was, in fact, already, deposited into our accounts in December, but otherwise it would be to suggest that, oh, we didn't know, we thought it was 14, but then January came and we got this big, 13 million more came rolling in, and I don't think that's what happened.
So the 14 was developed in October. That's where we came up with the 14.1 million. Going down the list, sales taxes in particular, they're received 3 months, and I'll go through and I'll hit PPRT too. So sales taxes are received 3 months in the rear, which means as of October, when we developed our projection, we would have only had sales tax data through July. So we only had a half a year worth of data, and we were assuming that inflation, which is really, really impacting these revenues when you look back at previous years, we assumed that would level off, and that's why we fell significantly short on sales taxes, because we were only working with 6 months of data. I think that these tools that we're talking about today are helping us so that moving forward, we do a little better with our projections, but for sales taxes, we had data through July. Real estate transfer taxes, that's one where it only takes one really big property to really move the number there. It takes one big commercial building or office building in December selling that could make up that difference.
But we can also, like, I asked for some of the closing dates, like, we know ahead of time what's going to be closing out, too. And I think we can do a better job of projecting the real estate transfer tax. I know
Understood.
we can do a much better job. I just think it's so important this year. I hope we can come much closer to the real surplus so that we can more appropriately levy and charge our residents.
And
Understood.
Clayton, you started in June? Or was it last year? I mean, we did
Late-
have an
late
open
August.
budget position,
Late
which would
August,
not
yeah.
have helped in August,
Yeah.
right? And so I think, look, we've talked about this, that I think we're in a much better position now. We just have to take all the possible learning we can, because to Councilmember Kelly's point, this was too big of a miss, right? I mean, there's conservatism and then there's too big of a miss, but I think we have better tools. We have better, your position filled and you have more experience, and hopefully we can just get a whole lot closer and not have this degree of material change
Agree.
this year.
PPRT, just touching on that one, the last two payments were received in December and January. So those were the last two payments for fiscal year '22. So yes, we did get a really big payment in mid-December, and we got our final payment for 2022 in January, which was for December of '22. Those totaled probably close to I don't have the numbers, but they were very big payments, and I know you probably have them in front of you with the information handed out. So there were big numbers handed out, or that we received really late in the budget process. And the way that it works too is we get notified by the state what our payment's going to be early in the month, and then our accounting division works through a rectification process throughout the month, and it actually gets recorded as an actual probably 2 weeks after the state posts the payment online. So I'm just cutting teeth here, but the December payment may have been received and officially recorded either the day or 2 days before the city council approved the budget. So it would have been really, really close.
Do we have no way of predicting what that payment is going to be, even approximately, or is it a surprise every time you open the email?
Generally, when you look at past data and you look at trends, we know when we're going to get our big payments. The big payments are in December and January, it seems. Also big payments in May, maybe one other summer month as well. So we know we're going to get big payments, but we don't know the number until it actually gets posted on the
So-
state website.
Yeah, go ahead.
A brief comment.
During May, I went on the website, I gave you the link, so you can go look, and it may not be.
Yeah,
it may not be in your wallet,
Feel
but
free.
it's posted right on the website.
Right, there's the issue date.
1.9 million.
Right, we
I mean-
can see the issue date and the EFT. You can actually see the
Let me just add
dates.
this thing, you know.
Mr.
When we
Desai.
do the budget, we rely upon the number we get from the IML, which is per capita. That, okay, the PPRT for the upcoming year would be this one. The other thing is, I think he touched on Clayton, that sometimes we get notified, particularly in the last year, where, oh, yeah, you're going to get additional money in PPRT. And if you look at the trend of last 5 years, whatever, last year is the exception. And that comes, like, say, in December, right after the council passed that, right? So even though, like, okay, you have approved the budget, next day I know, or next week I know, I cannot come to the council and let's change it, you know? But we just, and obviously, as we have been mentioning for the last 6 months, already we are comparing current year PPRT with the last year. It is going down. Even just yesterday, I think we received the communication, or last week, right? That there will be a reduction of 5% because of some error at the state level. So it would be a 5% less in the PPRD, but 5% more on our local government distributive fund. So yeah, we try our best, you know. In terms of like the other thing which we have seen is, okay, why we miss? As Clayton touched on that, when we started this process in October, we had only 6 months of revenue for use tax, home rule sales tax, And constantly I've been getting the emails, and I'm ready to share, and that's what we will do. We'll try to improve, that, okay, inflation is going to ease down. It would be a normal 2% starting the spring of 2023. So we were kind of taking into the account that, okay, we might have just, few months of 2023 at a higher inflation. And we will come back to around 2.5%, 3% inflation, which would affect all our home rule sales taxes plus the sales tax and other things. And the other thing which you have to know that's like on the expense side, which is like almost a $3 million, we thought, we would have the hiring, we would spend more on these things, a vacancy. But obviously, there was like a HR department was struggling to kind of fill all the positions. There was a labor shortage. I mean, a budget manager position, I could fill in after 7 months. We started the process in January. Yes, go ahead.
On the PPRT, who determines how it's allocated? Is it legal? Is it finance?
What we do is PPRT is ultimate impact is just to kind of, I'm glad you raised that thing. PPRT money, there were like two things. One thing, I think he touched on that, the Department of Commerce says you should first use towards Social Security, IMRF, police pension, and before it becomes that. Department of Revenue, there's one thing which, and I found 15 years back some worksheet where it says you should give in certain prorated at the time of 79 when this was abolished, the tax, and then PPRD came into the effect. But ultimately the impact is same. Why? Right now I put PPRD money into general fund, right? And I give around $325,000 to police pension out of PPRD and $280,000 to fire pension. So the rest of money goes into general fund. If I first use this towards, say, in some fashion, prorated toward fire pension, police pension, Social Security, and IMRF pension, obviously, and then general fund would go down in revenues then, because now the PPRD used up giving to this other fund. So ultimate impact is that, okay, my property tax levy for pensions could go down and my corporate levy could go up. But ultimate tax burden on the resident could be the same overall.
So there's no set standard or rules, you just decide where.
Right,
it's-
because at the same time, and I think he touched on that, the Department of Commerce clearly says that when you use this money towards the pension fund, you should reduce the corresponding tax levy. You cannot do double dipping, that you give it to them and still keep the levy. So that's, and that's very critical. So, and yes, again, we will continue to improve. Getting contradicting email even last month. Inflation is going to go down. Now there will be a rate cuts. This is the last rate. And you would know sometimes, like who are following the interest rates, And we try our best, yes, on both sides, expense side and income. Even, yes, we missed, I would say in a sense that about the recreation revenues, We never knew that we realized that, okay, there was some increase, but suddenly we came to know that for the out-of-residents, non-resident, it was a 30% increase. And for the resident, it was a 10% increase. So obviously, that was a big surplus in that thing too, Sure.
Chair.
How do we determine the reserves versus surplus? So is there a certain reserve amount we have to keep and then the rest we can spend? Or how do we determine that?
Right. So here's the thing. It is not by the state required. It is the city council which kind of last as a part of the budget process said we will keep 16.6% as a fund balance or the reserve. So which is 2 months of operating expense. But it is not mandated by any state statute or anything. You can go up to 10, 20, different communities have different percentages.
I believe Mr. Reed had a comment as well.
Yes, thank you. Two things. One, I think a direct answer to the question there about who decides how PPRT's funds are spent. Hitesh covered it really well, but I think that just direct answer is the council. The council ultimately makes all of those decisions. And then, as far as the reserve fund, I think we actually need to have a true reserve fund that is separate of the general fund just for transparency's sake and to make it clear to, both council members and residents, how much money do we actually have in surplus and not, above what we need to keep in reserve. And so I've long advocated that we would create an actual reserve fund. And so I'm hoping, folks see that as potentially even helpful here. That's something this committee can get behind.
Councilmember Kelly.
Just to dovetail on Councilmember Reed's comment, I mean, we do have, 10 funds? 10 funds altogether, and each has a set reserve fund amount. So 16.6 for the general reserve, but for example, motor fuel tax, I believe, is a 25% right reserve. So they each have varying amounts, and I think tonight we're just looking at general fund. So Councilmember Reed, to your point, that would mean, we have, I believe, 10 funds. So that would be separate funds, which I agree with you. I'm not sure if we would then have 10 separate reserve funds for each of those funds.
No, I think the reserve fund is most important. Sorry to interrupt. For the general fund, that's our largest reserve. The other ones, we can figure that out.
I believe it's closer to 30 funds, isn't it? But
40.
many of them are restricted on their use of the.
No, I think it's 9 or 10.
We have 40 funds in the
40
city.
funds.
Sub-funds, but in terms of the funds that you can't, for example, that we pass a budget amount on that,
11 of our 40 funds have fund balance policies, reserve policies.
meaning that you.
We have to keep
Right.
the council said we have to keep a balance of X in 11 of our
those
40
funds.
funds.
Where are those accounted, like, where do we see those reserve balances? Are they embedded in there, or are they?
If you take a look at our monthly report, it shows the fund balance of all 41 of our funds. And within those 41 funds, if you put that next to the 10 that have fund balance policies, you can start to get an idea of those 11 funds, which ones have available excess reserves. And as the chair said, one of those funds is, and Councilmember Kelly actually mentioned it, the motor fuel tax fund. You couldn't take the excess reserves from the motor fuel tax fund and put them into a reserve fund with general funds, because of the 11 funds that have reserve fund balance policies, the general fund is the most unrestricted, but many of the other ones carry restrictions as to how you can and can't spend it.
And they're also subject to, in terms of like overspending, you have to amend for those 11. I believe those are the ones, not the 44, because many of those are funds within funds. I think it's just on those 11 that, for example, you have to amend your budget should you overspend one of those funds.
We actually have to amend if we overspend in any of the 40.
Not the sub.
So like
not
the TIFs, the SSAs, they were in last night's budget amendment because we overspent by $800 in one of the SSAs, and the state law says you have to amend to match spending.
Could I go back to your,
I cannot hear what's being said in the room, so if the microphone could be turned on.
Can you hear me, Councilmember Reed?
Sorry.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back to this, to your comment that, or to Hitesh's comment that you don't have to put PPRT, amend or put it towards the pensions. My understanding in reading a whole bunch of documents online is that we are required to allocate to the PPRT to the pensions. Am I misinformed?
As I said, we have two kind of documents right now available. One from DCEO, Department of Commerce. I've been trying to reach them for last kind of couple of weeks, send them an email. I'm waiting for a response that, okay. And specifically, I asked the Department of Revenue too, because they have their own thing, and they say, yeah, you have to go by the 1979 percentage when these came into place. And as I said, I came up with one worksheet, and I think even you might have it when we had the actuary named Ted Windsor. He mentioned something in his report that, yes, 4.79% of the, PPRT should go towards the police pension and fire pension. This must be the percentage decided in 79, so I don't know. While DCE says, yes, you should use the money first towards the Social Security pensions like IMRF, fire, and social. Now, what is the ultimate impact? Because I see that different communities, we're trying to gain, and they all talk about some percentage level. So, and I'm trying to reach out to the other communities, okay, what are you doing? But what would be the ultimate impact? Right now, like say PPRT goes into general fund, right? And then, okay, since general fund has extra that $3 million, $4 million, $5 million, we can kind of reduce our corporate tax levy. Now, if you say, okay, there's no, why don't you give it to the pensions and social, whatever, yes. So that means what? My general fund would lose that revenue of $3 million. So now when I'm trying to balance my corporate levy, I might have to raise that. So it is more like a semantics or optics or whatever. But again, yes, I mean, if you have some certain ways and you can kind of recommend something and kind of forward it to the council, and we can go like that. But ultimate impact in my mind is, for the tax levy purpose, is nothing.
Right, so it's about priorities, right? It's about priorities and spending. And I want to say also in the state statute, it makes reference to first, that monies received by taxing districts from the personal property tax replacement fund shall be first applied toward the proportionate share of the pension or retirement obligations. So it's really those outstanding obligations. It's really, both in the state statute and in the Department of Commerce. So, I mean, I think whether or not, we can use it towards something else, maybe, but we certainly should. I think we've all expressed here that we have a priority. This money, it is intended or recommended to be used towards outstanding pension debt. So at this point, we are heavily burdened with a very large outstanding liability for our public safety pensions. I think absolutely we should be applying this so that at least we know that that portion of money will be going annually. And not only that, I've talked with people at ratings agencies. They said when you do this, and I can't remember the term, on a continuing basis, that really has a very positive impact on ratings. When a council passes an ordinance to say every year, this allocation, this appropriation, this money will go towards pensions, that has a very definite positive impact on our ratings. So I hope that we can move towards that. Not only will it help us in reducing our pension obligation, but again, it will give us a stronger standing with
Couple of
rating agencies.
clarifications, Councilmember Kelly. The first thing is, yes, I'm working with even I have emailed our corporation counsel who is out for, so yes, to have a legal opinion that, okay, can you work with the legal department at DCO or others, and give us the exact direction. That's the one thing. So we will wait for that, yes, and I can come up and even in next meeting, you can have that recommendation. I'm waiting for even Department of Commerce. Second thing is, it won't change the pension obligation liability because it's just a matter of money coming from which source, but the amount remains the same. If the actuary tells me that it is give $10 million for police pension, I will give $10 million at 100% funding, right? That 10 million now comes from, say, 3 million from PPRD, another 7 million from the tax levy. Right now what's happening that, okay, we give 9.5 million out of tax levy and 0.5 million from PPRD. So it's just changing the funding source. It's not increasing the amount.
But it's a guaranteed funding source, and that's what's important to rating agencies. This is money that we will get annually from the state, but that's why also I proposed here an equation so that every year we are full funding, which will also positively impact. But that when you rely on a regular funding source that you will get every year and you're allocating that, you're appropriating that towards your debt obligation, that's as opposed to saying we will pay this amount. Maybe we won't have that amount, but this is something that we will get every year. It's a funding source that we can count on, albeit, and I would like to say also, I do think in the past, I think now we're looking at the IML, but clearly in the past we weren't relying on those projections because you under budgeted by so much over these past years with regard to the PPRT. I mean, it was drastically under budgeted.
So pension is
I would-
our third item, and I think
Okay.
we'll talk about this more. But I think, the highlight from the final view on the variance, right? I think we're in a much better position to not have a variance of this scale, of course. And there was a spike in PPRT, and fortunately, we ended up in a higher funding position than a less one. But I think there, as we've talked about, there were some oddities relative to the pandemic and other things, open positions that impacted that. So let's roll forward a year then, right? Because I think we've as that has shown, there is more pressure on us to update our projections more frequently. And here we are in May, and this is sort of in light of what we saw in 22 versus the final 22 and what we've seen so far year to date. We're looking at a new projection relative to 23. So how does this roll forward into what we're thinking now with 23? Also in light of the new public safety union contracts that came into, that were approved earlier this year. So let's Clayton, if you could take us through sort of our first view, not going to be the last time, of what's the projection for '23. I would suggest we look at it again in August, we look at it again during the budget cycle, and we will find a way that we don't, we might want to be slightly conservative, but we're not going to have that degree of variance between what we really think the current year is and how we roll that in the next budget. So Clayton, if you could take us through what you're currently seeing for the '23 projection.
Okay, and I will try to be brief because I know we want to get to that third item as well. So this is updated from last month. It adds one column on the far right. It's in your packet as well, page 8. This shows an update of projected revenues at this super early preliminary stage. And so as we mentioned last month, we could see anywhere between $6 and $10 million in potential revenue upside. That's based on really those 8 revenues that were on the last slide that finished last year strong. We also used our projections from last year to base our budget this year, so that's why we are comfortable thinking that some of those revenues may be a bit short. Those in green are the ones that have been increased. There are just 2 in red that I highlighted, the wheel tax and the local motor fuel tax, both kind of our only 2 revenues that have trended behind budget in recent years. Moving on to the general fund forecast, when you combine...
Can I just ask?
Yes.
I just looking at, 22 actual, 23 projection, I take it that you have increased this by 6.5? Yeah,
Correct.
It still looks like a conservative budget, a conservative reforecasting. And I know that there's a lot of year to go. We'll continue to update it. Specifically on PPRT, what's your current view on why you think we're dropping from 5.5 to 3.5? And how firm is that, given, as we saw last year, that is probably our most volatile, aside from maybe building permits, our most volatile revenue stream?
I'll touch on the number, and then I'll let Hitesh jump in. So IML was projecting I believe, 29% drop? 33% drop in their most recent numbers. And so that's in the realm of what this 5.5 million to 3.5 million is reflective of. Additionally, we did just get information, as Hitesh said last Friday, that the state made an error in some of their allocations, and we're going to see a 5% drop in PPRT and a 5% increase in our local government distributive fund payouts. They paid out actual LGDF money intended for LGDF through our PPRT disbursements, so they're correcting that error as part of future disbursements, so that's why we see that drop.
And I just want to touch on one thing and stress that which is very important. Yes, we can look into revenues, dig into that, and come up with a better projection. But I don't want ultimately to look just revenues in isolation, because ultimately at the end of the day, we are concerned with the operating surplus or deficit. Why I'm talking about all the expenses are up. Police contracts, fire contracts, APSME contracts, all the equipment, all the supplies, all the CIP. Almost every project, I was talking to Lara last night during the council meeting, has an overage. So yes, it's good and bad about the inflation. Yes, you're getting all these revenues, sales tax and higher. At the same time, you are paying a lot more for equipment, the fuel, the CIP cost, labor cost, and everything, including the salaries and all those contracts. So I just want to keep, and that's why we always bring it up, like, is it there, Clayton, that potential use of the surplus? Or coming down, yeah. So I just kind of request the council members and the committee members here, put it in the, yes, we can talk about in the ISO right here, but when it comes down to making decisions, like I think the chair was referring to earlier before the start of the meeting, just look at the operating surplus or deficit, that, okay, what are the revenues? We are getting this much higher than budgeted. Okay, what are the expenses, where we will be paying a lot more than what we have budgeted.
And one more question. I know that there are many hundreds of items in there, but if you look just at the all other, we are dropping from 26.5 to, just under 23. Do you have a sense of any of the major items in there, or is it just many, many items that are accumulating to that? So
many items, trying to think of what it is, and
yeah, okay.
I don't
Sorry
have
to
it
put you on the
in front of
spot.
mine,
I should have
but,
asked you that before. So I good progress on updating the projection for sure, and we have to look at the expense side as well. I would not be surprised as the year rolls forward to find that we still have some degree of revenue upside. relative to what is here. And so let's just keep an eye on it, and I think our whole process is to just make sure the data we're using is as accurate as possible.
Understood. 1 million of that is a transfer from the motor fuel tax fund to the general fund that we used to do, that we chose not to do as part of this year's budget. So I imagine there's a lot of those one-time things like that particular transfer that may be within that all other general fund revenue.
So we'll roll forward now to the,
In terms of the
Expense
forecast, so I wish I could find a way to make these a little bigger on the screen so you can see it, but it is in your packet as well. So when you combine the $26 million net operating surplus right here for 22 with the existing fund balance in the general fund prior going into 22, so that's the 31 million here, you see an ending fund balance at the end of 22 of 57.9 million. So very strong general fund balance moving into 23. The far right column shows these updated revenue and expense projections for 23. So you can see revenues have gone up by the amount that we are suggesting, the 6 million, and then we're highlighting two things here in green. In terms of salary and benefits, projecting about a $3 million over budget amount for the police and fire pension contract, or police and fire contracts, and an increase in transfers. And this is all the CIP projects that have come in over budget that the council has approved thus far to date. So when you consider that, our budget had a projected net deficit of 10 million, and so we were covering that with fund balance. By the time you consider these additional revenues and the additional unbudgeted expenses so far, we're still in that realm. So we're sitting around 9 million. So despite these additional expenses, as long as we recognize that upside in revenues, we're kind of where we started and have a projected fund balance at the end of 23 of the $48 million. As we've been saying since last year's budget, though, these numbers at the bottom speak volumes as to how much this inflationary environment has impacted Evanston's fund balance. So you can see 49%, 37% prior to 2021 when this inflation really kicked in. You can see we weren't even meeting the 16.66 fund balance policy, and you have to go all the way back to the early 2000s to even see where we were over 20%. So this time is really an unprecedented time, and we find ourselves in a very fortunate position. So important to make sure that we make good decisions and not consider this the norm moving forward.
I'm curious. I thought that you had to come back and get council approval if you went over.
Are you referring to 23 or?
2022, the 10 million. Am I wrong?
Are you talking about this 10 million right here?
Yes.
So that's our budget for FY23. So the budget that was approved by City Council had a deficit of 10 million when approved. Most of that was the transfer to pensions, the $3 million that was moved to the reparations fund, with the additional $2.5 million really covered by general fund reserves.
Maybe I'm asking the wrong question then.
I think so. So, I mean, there was, because we reduced, which I don't think is a good way to do this, what we did this year by reducing our last year's budget instead of simply amending the budget to increase the amount for the funds that were overspent. I think the question is, how much was overspent? And I understand that there was a surplus, but how much?
In the general fund, it goes back to this slide where our expense budget was 117.9 million, and we actually only spent 116.6 million.
But in other funds, there was a total, I think, 2 million, right? Was it 2 million
about-
total?
I think it was like a $2 million, $2.5 million increase among the 10 or 11 funds that needed increased.
Right. So I guess I think that's the question. Like, we had agreed the previous year that just in general that we're going to give the finance and budget, we project that this fund is going to be over, regardless of the surplus. I mean, that's a bigger problem, obviously, that there's so much surplus that we didn't have a handle on. But also, assuming that we have a better handle on surplus and in general, I think the idea of respecting a budget, I think it's, it's the due diligent thing to do, to say, we project that we're going to be overspending in this fund. We'd like to, we're going to be looking towards an amendment to bring that forward ahead of time, as opposed to, 5 months right before the audit. We got to amend it really fast because we're going to get audited, because that's the way it always feels. I think I know interim city manager Kelly Gandursky agreed to that when I held it over the previous year, asked when there was an 11.5 million over expenditure, that going forward, we would be apprised first instead of 5 months afterwards. So I also have one question. With that 30, with this the 31, where is it? The ending surplus, does that, the ending fund balance, where is it?
This 31 point, excuse me, 4 million right here,
Right, so at the end of
21, 21.
okay.
So the audited fund balance at the end of last year was 31.4 million.
Right.
And then
And
now
so-
we've got a projected additional surplus, net operating surplus of 26 million, which would result in a fund balance of 57.9 million in the general fund.
So 26 million surplus from 22. Does that, my question is, we, with that surplus at the end of the year, with the 14.1 that we thought we had, we allocated some of that, like, for example, to the pension fund. Does that 26 include the additional, what was it, the additional 4.5 or?
That's all going to be accounted for in our 2023 budget number that you see here, which is the 10.1 million that I was talking about. So our 2023 budget in the general fund had a net operating deficit. We were projected to spend 10 million more than we took in revenues. And that 10 million includes the 4.5 million for additional contributions to pensions, and included it's accounted for through the $3 million move of real estate transfer taxes from the general fund to reparations, which meant we were really only covering about 2.5 million of general fund operations with that $57 million. So this is our budget. If we finish at 57.9 million, we spend an additional 10 million, and if we just rely on our budget number, that means we finish 23 at 47.9 million.
And
But that 10 was surplus money, though, that we spent. So I think that has to be added in. So for transparency's sake, I mean, that money that we put into reparations, that was from the surplus budget, as was the additional payment towards the pensions. I mean, in terms of having a realistic idea of really where we ended the year, I think that has to be.
I think the
Point of
incremental pension
information,
payment is a
just-
23 item, not a 22
And-
item.
Right.
It went through
and point of-
23, not 22.
And a point of information.
I think the 22.
Can I be heard?
Yeah, sure, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Point of information for Councilmember Kelly, the reparations money did not come from surplus funds. That came from the real estate transfer tax.
Right, from 23, the real estate, I understand that, but the pension payment, that did come directly out of the year-end surplus of the 14.1.
And that's how it's reflected here. It's a fundamental part of the current year deficit is 10 in 23 or 9 through the current projection. That includes the incremental 4.5. So it is reflected in the fact that the current year budget is in deficit 9, but there's plenty of reserve given where we ended 22 to pay that. So it really, I think we're just talking about semantics between
Right.
the 2 years.
It's just about transparency, though, for the public to say it's 57, not 47, how we ended, because we did allocate some of the surplus. I think everyone wants to know, like, when we budget, if we budget 300 million, but in fact, we only spent 200, like, the public should know that. And that's why I'm saying, so the money we did take, and yes, your point's taken, Councilmember Reed, I remember now that that's for 23 transfer taxes, but the pension payment did come out of the year-end surplus.
Councilmember Kelly, just a clarification how the things work. The council approved $4.5 million for 23 budget, as a part of 23 budget. And why did the council approve that? Your point, yeah, that, okay, we have a healthy surplus as of 22 projected, and so let's budget $4.5 million extra for 23 payments, the tax levy. So it was budgeted in 23 because 22 budget was already adopted a year back.
This is for the 23 pension, but we took it from the 22 surplus.
We cannot take it like that. It was approved as a part of 23 budget.
And there was adequate surplus to
Right.
fund it,
We
and that's
took-
why the
That's
surplus
why-
goes,
Why
is
the council
impacted
made
this
the
year.
decision to give 4.5 out of the general fund? Because it has a healthy fund balance. And it was expected to close the 22 with a healthy fund balance. So just like what happened in reparations, that, okay, let's transfer $3 million out of transfer tax. Right. Okay, but yes, again, just to clarify, it is there in our 23 budget, and City Council approved as a part of 23 budget process to give extra $4.5 million to the pension fund to get to the 100% that funding
Okay.
by 24.
I guess I'm not making myself clear. I think we need to have transparency in terms of what we're actually ending the year with. And I just want to make the point that that money was taken from what we were told was a $14.1 million surplus.
Point of information. I think Councilmember Kelly, we're all saying the same thing. Yes, you were correct that it was taken from, or that the reasoning for us in our 2023 budget allocating this 100% annual funding was because of, yes, that $14 million surplus in 2022, but it was not budgeted for 2022, right? This is a 2023 expenditure. So that is why it is listed in the 2023 budget and not 2022, which I think is what I'm hearing you say.
Right. I'm just saying that we need to have a full accounting of a year-end surplus, get closer to it because we're way off, and that needs to be included when we decide to allocate expenditures in the subsequent year based on surplus. That still, nevertheless, it represents surplus. So we can say, oh, we got a $50 million surplus, we're going to take 25, and instead of issuing a bond next year, we're going to use that surplus. But it's still, we need to have a more accurate accounting of our surplus. That's all I'm saying.
So let's go to the next page now, if we could, because this is on to that point of, given the final surplus position of 23, how is that being used in the current year?
Yes. So bottom line, general fund, great position going into 23, and we've been able to use the fund balance at the end of 22 to cover a number of things. We used the $10.1 million to balance the general fund. We've covered overages on 3 CIP projects that came in over budget due to inflation, and we've been able to cover higher than budgeted wage increases for police and fire. Also included in this list are several items on the horizon that may come back to this committee in some way, shape, or form. One which I guess won't come back to this committee, but ASME contract negotiations underway. Still waiting on an estimate, but it's likely going to be higher than the 4.5% wage increases that we included in our budget. We continue to see projects come in over budget. Last night, another project came to City Council, the Main Street project, which needed to utilize general fund reserves, and we anticipate that trend to continue, given where inflation's at. Next item is pensions, which I won't get into quite yet. And then additionally, a potential transfer to CIP fund per fund balance policy in order to reduce and delay GO bonds. So over the last 2 years, we've had $23 million in maturities of our bonds, and we haven't replaced that with any new debt. The City Council's approved bond resolutions totaling $28 million versus the $23 million in maturities, so it's fairly close, and we should be ready in the coming months to have some additional discussions around what our bond obligations may look like this year. And then,
Is this real? It says reserves. Is this reserves or surplus?
general fund reserves, it's surplus is a one-time thing. You capture a surplus, and then that surplus goes into the general fund balance. Anything over that 16% is considered your reserves in the general fund.
I'm just getting,
So-
I just wanted the semantics.
Yes. And then additionally, at the bottom, we have a couple potential transfers per fund balance policy. So the insurance fund and the parking fund are two of those 11 funds that do have fund balance policies, and both of them are well below what that reserve balance says they should be. So if we were to follow our fund balance policy, we would move $7 million to those funds immediately out of the general fund reserves. But we're opting to continue having some of these discussions before we make those types of decisions. I think that
And how
kind of
much
covers.
do we have left after after all these approvals?
So this is the best way to show it because this general fund forecast does account for all of those expenses. And so this projected column shows that with those items that have been approved so far, we would be sitting, if 23 projections hold true, with a $49 million fund balance. And you can see down here, 26 million of that 49 million would be considered that excess reserve above the 16%.
I'm curious, when did the council vote in all those overspending, or like the pet shelter? Was that recently, or?
Yeah, they've been approved as part of the city council items over the last few months. So when those items go to city council, they say that they're over budget by X, and we'll use general fund reserves in order to cover the difference.
Is there a dollar amount that needs to be approved, or anything over has to be approved
For
by the council?
for like CIP projects.
Or overages?
I imagine they would all be subject to our purchasing policies, so anything over $25,000, the city council would get approval on. If it's not budgeted, staff can internally do things less than 25,000, but anything over 25,000, the city council would see.
So everything in green has been approved?
Correct.
You said already. So our real decision items have to do, and we kind of went through quickly, if we're going to bond this year, I think that's a more significant discussion that probably we would have in the August, September timeframe. But I think a key point that you brought up, we did not do a bond deal last year, as everyone knows. This year, we have approximately $10 million of maturities as well. So that would end up being about a $25 million use of available liquidity if we don't do any bond deal this year. So we'll want to get your analysis as to why we want to do a bond deal, but I think having substantial maturities without replacing that with debt and actually seeing the debt drop is putting a lot of pressure on the general fund. So
Not necessarily the general fund, but the capital.
or whichever,
capital fund. Right.
general or the capital fund. So I don't think that's a discussion for right now, but we have had, every year, not only do we have expenses, but we have bond maturities. And so there would have been over a 2-year period,
Right.
you said $25 million worth of maturities.
Correct.
So I don't think anybody is considering we need to do $25 million worth of issuance, but to have $25 million worth of maturities that just come out of available liquidity, that's a lot.
Can we schedule on the next meeting to discuss bonds?
I think that, let's get into pensions, because I think on pensions, it would be great to have what we think is a final funding policy that we could go through.
I would say both, but I think it's important because
Yeah.
rates are high, and I think we should be giving firm direction with regard to just because we have, bonds maturing, whether we want them to roll over at a high rate or not. I think we have to discuss this sooner than later. So I would, yes, I agree. I want us to move forward with a recommendation for a firm plan to fully fund our pensions, but I also think we should discuss sooner than later the issue of bonds.
Absolutely.
issuance
So
of
over the
bonds.
course of the summer, I think our normal course would be to do a bond issuance in the September, October
I
timeframe.
mean, the past practice is we started the process, because it takes 3 months.
Yeah.
So in the past,
So
we
certainly
have always sold the
July,
bonds in
August.
mid-August and then
July.
closed the deal in first week of September. And why we do it in September, so that it kind of is within 90 days, so we can do some current refunding. But right now, I don't think there is a benefit to do any refundings. So we'll see that. Next month, I think Lara, our city engineer, is planning to come here to this committee with the proposed CIP for 2024. And I think the month of July would be a kind of ideal to talk about the debt.
Okay.
Once the kind of committee and the council kind of decides on the contract.
So maybe get a preliminary view in June, and in July have a more fulsome discussion about what exactly you're proposing and why relative to a bond issuance.
But the most important
For a
thing
piece
would
of
be,
the-
right, but the
of
most
the
important
maturities.
thing would to kind of have some consensus on the projects to move forward, because that will decide the amount. And then the second piece would be the funding, how we fund that. If we decide to move forward, it's at least 5 or 10 or 15 projects. So, but yeah, Lara is planning to do that. Obviously, the council wanted that. Mayor kind of mentioned last year too, that when you come up with the budget in October, and then we talk about some of the heavy things, like debt and CIP, we rather have an early start. So that's what we are doing this year. CIP is, so we want this ideally kind of CIP settled in by the time we come up with our proposed budget in October first week. And that gives the committee a good chance to kind of go over the projects and the funding.
I think the problem with, kind of repeatedly having these big reserve funds or excess funds, it gives council kind of a false sense of what they have, what they have to play with per se. I mean, if you look at another increase for $1.5 million on that animal shelter, which is already, must be over $1,000 a square foot now. I think mentally put people in the position of thinking, hey, there's all this money to play with. But if we could get closer, we could really kind of have a better understanding, and we could give our council members really good data and kind of give them a much better perspective on what it is they're spending on and where they are in terms of their reserves. I think without that kind of discipline, we seem to have but it's just difficult to see how this is sustainable. And then when we're talking about, yeah, $25 million of debt rolling off, but at a much lower interest rate. I mean, that's just a wheel, a hamster wheel that if we get on where we're issuing debt at much more, expensive levels, and then having debt roll off at much less level, I just don't see how that's sustainable.
Right, and I also think I agree. I think these huge surpluses that we don't find out about until much later does not lend itself to budgetary discipline. And what happens is, we can spend an extra 1.5 on the shelter because we have this extra money. And that's what happens is we start to overspend because, guess what? As it turns out, no worries because we had, $25 million extra. And it's not, we need to be deciding this as a public, as a democratic body in the fall and in the winter when we're doing our budgetary process and then staying within our budget. And so this kind of, doesn't lend itself, this system of finding out months later that there's this huge surplus, but it just allows and it lends itself to overspending. And so whereas maybe our residents would prefer that we levied lower, or maybe we spent on something else, but it's kind of becomes very unwieldy when it's presented this way. So I hope we can be much more accurate this year in our in understanding of our surplus, and hopefully in subsequent years get closer and not end up the year with such enormous surpluses, and maybe offer some relief to our residents.
Very good. So the final topic that we wanted to talk about tonight was where we're headed on pensions. And if I could just start by saying, as we said in other meetings, I think we have a unanimous view that we want to fund it 100%. We have the numbers from Foster and Foster now. It gave us a revised path to 100% funding by 2040. These numbers will have to be regularly revised because there's, both sides move. The liability moves, the assets move based on actual returns. But I think we're in a good position now to really have a better view on what is the expected contribution path to get to our mutual goal of 100% funding by 2040. So it took a while to get to these numbers. They had to be revised because of the new union contracts. This is the best current view, and when they do a formal actuarial study for next year and 24's contribution, we'll get somewhat different numbers. But now we have a better view of, over this path, what is the what are the expected contributions, and we can think about how do we directly link those to revenue sources or general fund available sources. So
point of information, these numbers are based on the current public safety contracts, the new contracts.
There's an estimate in there.
Okay.
Yes, there's an estimate in there.
But-
I think it will be firmed up more when they're actually working with specific census data that has those higher pay levels in it. But they have done their best to reflect a higher rate of inflation in these projections. So they will remain volatile, but this is better than what we've
But these
had.
numbers do not include consideration of a pending AFSCME increase. But I'm sorry, we still have one contract, which is
That's
under negotiation.
IMRF, which is funded somewhat differently.
IMRF, we have the things and we fund it, and the AFSCME, which has no impact on the police or fire pension.
Right, but so the AFSCME contract, whatever those numbers are, will not impact.
No.
We're just
Because
talking,
this is
I'm sorry,
strictly-
we're just looking at police and fire pension
Right.
here. Okay,
It would have an impact on our general fund surplus, yes. But
got it.
not
I'm
on
with
the-
you.
Right. I'm just curious, I noticed it's the 6.25, is that now it just seems like, why don't we have estimates with 6.25? Because that has been and I thought that was still the recommended rate of assumption from our actuary.
We've been using 6.5.
Right, but that hasn't been the recommended amount. And so I'm recommending that we go by what our actuary recommends, which is, I believe, 6.25 still. Mr. Mortel, do you know if it's? It's 6.25, right?
Got it right here, page 5, 6.25.
6.25. So we should, I mean, the numbers that we presented, or the numbers that I have and went over, were based on a 6.25.
I think the assumption is ours, not the actuaries,
Well, we
right?
both hired-
But at any rate, we're at 6.5.
6.5 for the last few years, 6.25 is the recommendation from the pension boards, their thing. I think I mentioned in the memo, you would see that like a larger picture at the state level, that they are using 6.8 and 7.125 for the pension and police pension and fire pension at the state level for hundreds of pensions. So even when I talk to, and I think the Foster and Foster is the actuary for the state investment pools, and they say, yeah, these numbers are better, kind of, yeah, both the pension funds at the state level have a little difference. One of them is using 6.8, and the other one is using 7.125, and I think I have included in our memo.
What is the timeline for them to be included in the state pools?
I mean, ideally, we would like them. Fire is already part of that. I think the police is a part of some kind of what you call legal challenge.
A lawsuit, which
Yeah.
they
But yeah, so it's not
lost
fully
twice.
transitioned into that. But what would happen is when I was talking and looking at some of the other things, they would run their actuarial report, the investment pool for each city, and come up with the required contribution. So for the fire pension, I saw that, yeah, for some of the cities who kind of started from the very beginning, fire was a little late, so we don't have that actual report yet from them. But in the long run, that would be the norm. I think that we will be getting every city who is part of that, or almost all the pensions board,
Mr. Martell, do you have a brief comment?
I'm on the pension board. I can speak to this. The council does not set the assumption. You do not set that. That is set by our joint actuary. That's who sets it. They recommend 6.25. I've got it right here, this document. That's what they recommend. Now, the council, yes, they could go to any percentage they want, but I want it to be very, very clear. Hitesh, you're not an actuary. These guys are actuaries. They're trained in it. They know what they're doing. But excuse me, there's been a lot of false information that I've had
No,
to stay
I think
silent
the
here.
overall tone could improve. I think it could improve. There's too much accusation in all of our discussions that there's a conspiracy, that people are hiding things, that they don't know what they're talking about. We need to set that aside because I think people are doing their best with the information they have. We can improve on the clarity of the data, but I just wish we could get away from any sort of
Okay.
accusations.
If you give me a minute.
No, you know what, actually,
Okay, that's.
we're in our
that's-
general meeting.
We are, this is supposed to liaison with the pension boards, this committee.
I don't know
and-
why I hear you've got a report from my actuary that you're going to be going over. Why don't I have that?
It was posted in the packet. It's in the packet. The report that we have from Foster and Foster is in the packet.
It's in the packet, okay.
But I
It's
would
in the
like to know
packet.
why 6.25, who requested these numbers? Like, I have numbers with 6.25, so, Mr. Desai, did you choose not to get the numbers with 6.25? Because I see that the estimates were given are not based on the actuary's recommendation. It's only 6.5, and I'm not going to say which one generally I would want us to go with the actuary, trusting his judgment as an actuary, but I see that's not even one of the assumptions that you requested.
Couple of things. City has been using 6.5 as adopted by the city council. Ultimately, yes, the pension boards or actuary recommends, but the city council makes the decision. It's not my decision.
Based on
It's
your
the-
recommendation, and this is the way the city council acts for the most part, is based on staff's recommendation, that's what we do, and so that.
Yeah, let me
But
just
you should have
clarify.
at least have given us the option, asked him to at least provide the 100% funding at the rate that the actuary that we both use, the city and the pension boards, use. And by the way, I just also want to say, David, emotion is information, and I'd like you not to scold people who've taken time out of their day to come here. Incredible amount of work that Mr. Mortel put together for us. I mean, that is, I can't even imagine the number of hours. And as somebody serving the public, when people are frustrated, that's information to me. That's information that we now have a very precarious liability for our public safety pensions, our our first responders now, almost over $250 million. Please don't scold our first responders when they come out here and do all this hard work and present us with packets because they feel frustrated. Again, frustration is information. We should know that really, this has gone far enough, and we are glad we're going to turn it around, but we need to stay on that path.
Let's
Thank
just
you.
treat everyone with respect, and I think in particular the city staff who have been working on short positions, open positions for a long period of time.
And one
So,
more clarification.
Everyone, all of
I mean,
us,
yes,
all of
everyone,
us.
yes.
Let's
I
just
mean,
try
we
to keep
agree.
the tone a little bit higher.
I mean, I've been transparent, what I inherited, we see the 6.5. Few things. Look at the every year's report, like actual report, which I put it on the website, comes to the council. It has both numbers, 6.5 and 6.25%. If you look at the two, I always ask for that, okay, what are your numbers? So Foster & Foster provides the number based on 6.5% and 6.25%. If you can look at the last 3 years report posted, last 4 years report. Second thing is, I talked to the Foster & Foster, our own actuary, as well as the actuary for pension fund. And I'm like, I noticed that, okay, you are using 6.8 and 7.12. He said, with the consolidation of the funds, we expect to earn more, so we are comfortable as an actuary for the investment pool to use 6.8 and 7.125. So based on that, I'm like, okay, we can stay with 6.5, and he was comfortable. Even I have an email from him that more than 70% of the funds, pre-consolidation, use 6.5% or higher rate of return. Assumed rate of return. So all these factors go into it. It's not my decision at the end. Even if I suggest 6.5, council can say, no, we want to use 6%, 7%. Ultimately, it is the council's direction.
Right, no, and I understand with the
If I
consolidation.
could ask a question here. How frequently would it be indicated to revise that assumption? And what we're talking about, let's just clarify, we're
Right.
talking about a long-term assumption. We're saying over 20 years, the rate of return for each year would be 6.5%.
I mean,
So
there
we're
are,
we're not changing that number because interest rates are up this year and they go down next year, and we change this assumption, every year. But we don't necessarily need to be locked into an assumption for 20 years. We could revise it as time evolves, but it's not something that we're playing around with every year.
absolutely, and if you can look at the city of Evanston history, we used to be at 7%, 7.25%. Then we came down to 6.75%. Then we came to 6.5. And when you compare these numbers with the corresponding comparable municipalities, whether you take Elgin, Naperville, Schaumburg, Joliet, Buffalo Grove, and good financial conditions, they were using higher than that number. Even I have the article from 5 years back where Teachers Retirement Fund was using 8.125, and we were using 6.75.
But it was the exaggerated assumptions that really snowballed us to where we are with this huge debt obligation right now. It was because of exaggerated assumptions. That's what, in large part, got us into the big mess we're in now back in the early 2000s. So we do have to be careful with it. Every time, when we overestimate our assumptions, it can set us back. And so I understand that with the state consolidation, that they're expecting better, better returns. So I just want to be clear, though, with these three numbers that you requested, 6.5, 6.75, and 7.0, so are you saying that at this point, Jason, that they are not, so I know, Mr. Martelli, I'm just unclear as to what the actuary is recommending.
We could ask, Hitesh and I talked to Jason about the variables we wanted in this study. It's not a big item to ask him to run it at 6.25, but the fact is we're already at a substantial discount to the state funds. And what is a reasonable discount? I think we can monitor our actual performance for several years and say how close are the state funds getting to what their assumed rate of return is. So if is it the fire that's at 7.25, or is it the police? So 6.5 is already a substantial discount. What's the exact right number? I think we need more data to say. I think, again, we give, or the boards give, guidance to the actuary. I think Jason would say any of those numbers are fine with him. It's our judgment that he would then use to build into the projections and the calculations on the funding. It is not up to the actuary. It's up to the sponsor. It's up to the boards to determine, ultimately, it's probably up to the council more than anyone else as to what numbers we want to use. So, look, we're already at a discount. Is the right number 6.5? I would certainly agree with everyone. We should not be at 7.25 unless someone can really prove that's what they're going to achieve in the long run.
Right.
Because the higher it is, it artificially helps the funding position, but it exposes you that you're not
Sure.
going to get those
I
reserves.
would just think, though, that
Those
the
returns.
actuary would come forward with would recommend, based on, consolidation, everything else, and I do understand with the but I would expect that our joint actuary to be able to advise us best.
I don't think that's his role. I don't think he would view that as being his role. He could say, is it
Recommend.
reasonable? We can ask Jason, but
Okay.
again, to what Hitesh said, most communities are much closer to those published rates than we are. We're being conservative. I think being conservative is where we want to be. Do we need to be 6.25 versus 6.5? I think we have other items we should all get to resolution, and then we could maybe refine with some data over time should we be at 6.25 or 6.5?
Are we talking that the money's pulled at ISB, right? Illinois State Board of Investments? Is that
For
where it's-
fire, not police yet.
Okay, because I was on that board, but what we could do is maybe twice a year, we could get their performance reporting so we can start to get an idea of how they've done, because they're invested in a lot of things that we couldn't do in a smaller pension. They've got private equity. They actually buy real estate directly as opposed to pools. So I do believe that they probably will do a little better, but I think that we could do 6.25, 6.5, but I think our due diligence would be once or twice a year to get their performance, and I know the executive director there, and I would think if we're part of their plan, we could get that, so.
And you're right, Member Rikers, that with the consolidation, they are like now handling billions of dollars, So they expect to become a little bit more efficiency, invest in variety of things. And
Yeah, I'm
get a-
looking on their website now, they don't have the performance reporting on there.
Right.
It is an analysis we need is the
Right.
last several years.
They're
What have been
23
the
billion they're
Right.
managing
assumed
versus.
rates? Right.
And even in the past, we had one more thing which I used to keep an eye on, which was the Department of Insurance, which determines the rate of return, because they kind of do the pension compliance and all that.
So
And
we're
we
running
were
out of
at-
time.
Okay.
Okay, we're running out of time. I think that, one, we have to think about how we want to document this in a policy. But Councilmember Kelly, you had some language that I think we all need to better understand in your proposal, in your recommendation. And I think it's pretty fundamental, as we're kind of running out of time here. But again, I think everyone agrees, we want to be at the 100% numbers. No one disagrees with that. I think the part of, and we'll figure out what's the right amount of PPRT, again, whether it's coming out of general fund, unrestricted funds, or directly out of PPRT, we want to hit the total contribution regardless of what it should be. But you mention here that of the remaining balance, and I guess it's after PPRT, up to 90% of that, or
Just tell me, there's
90% of
5
that.
bullet points there, so 1,
Yeah.
2, 3, 4,
Maybe you
5.
can go through those.
Sure. So
Hey,
firstly.
could you just tell us what page we're looking at here?
I'm sorry.
We
so
are
it's
looking at page
24.
14 of 16.
Oh, I'm on 24 of 26 or 14.
I'm sorry, 24, 26, right.
So firstly, recommending the 100% funding. I think that, number one, we've all agreed upon. Number two, that we have a recurring appropriation of the PPRT money. So 100% of it. And again, there's a benefit to that, as my inquiries with some of the state rating agencies. So it also just assures a regular, routine chunk of money, and it will vary from year to year, but we know that that would be going to, since it is intended, and again, probably legally, maybe we can spend it on other things, but certainly we can put it all towards pensions. So I'm recommending that we establish a recurring appropriation of the PPRT. Again, it'll not only be something we can count on, but it'll also help our ratings. Number three, I'm saying with the difference that we fund, so currently we've been levying at about 90% of our obligation through the property levy. I would say that we levy up to, because as Mr. Desai pointed out last time, it's possible that there will be years when we, maybe even this year, that the PPRT would actually dip below a 90%. As you pointed out last time, we might have to lower that that one, maybe be 89%. So I don't want to stick to 90. But should it, for example, not, should it not approach 90, should it fall short, say, cover only, we still have to make up a little bit, at that point I would say that we would take it out of the surplus or reserve. And then finally, the fifth one, which I hope we can all get on board on, is when we have a large surplus, it's not locking us into this, but that we give real serious consideration to funding at 105%. So when we have, I'm not saying we do it, but it's something that we would consider during the budget season. When we have that kind of surplus, do we want to spend it on this, or do we want to put it in relieving some of that pension debt? So that's it in a nutshell.
And I think we could always make an incremental contribution that puts us further down the path to get the funding goal that we want. So another thing Foster & Foster gave us, which I thought was a great start, was a model funding policy that hits on almost all of your points, right, about how it really is unfair to the future. It's unfair to us now that we're having to deal with this deficit, right? And so it deals with all those sorts of issues and why it's important for any city council to take this seriously and get us back to the 100% sort of funding level. And I think that's a really good document to try to put in the specifics for us that we could approve. We could have people come in and, give us comments on it, but we could develop it over the next month, take in some comment, look to approve it as soon as we feel fully comfortable with it, and take it to the council and really give the council full guidance on how we think this works, what their obligation is for the future, or our guidance for the future. And take your ideas, take, our group thoughts, and get this into a document that legal can review and we can vote on. I think we all want to do that. We all have the same goal. There's different ways to ensure the contribution. You went through, some here. Maybe we can socialize some of those individually over the next month or so and say, here's our view of how we think the funding mechanism should work. Because I think that's one thing about the Blue Ribbon Committee's report that could have been more specific. Where's the money going to come from? And that's our hard part. We want to define where's the money coming from. PPRT, property tax, excess reserves, and what happens when none of that is enough. At what point should the council consider incremental changes to property taxes if necessary to stay on the path? So we can define that over the next month or so and get into a document that we think is fulsome, and we can vote on.
Dave, just as a point of interest, of those 5 points, was there anything that gave you particular pause?
So I think we can think about the contribution a little bit differently. An idea we could look at is a bias to keep property taxes flat, then look to what's available in the budget, the current year budget, then look at available reserves, and if all excess reserves, and if all of that is not sufficient, then consider a property tax increase.
I don't
That
think
would
that
be
this says
congruent with
anything
the-
different than that.
Well, it's referring to the 90%. I think we can
Up to 90. So
up,
just
up
be
to
clear,
90, right?
Up to 90.
So I think we don't have a big disagreement here. How do we define this the best way as to what are the priorities?
I think we want to be very careful. I think where the Blue Ribbon Committee actually may have made, or some of the offshoots of it may have made a little mistake, so we want to be very, very careful that we don't politicize this. And the way you politicize something that we so fundamentally are obligated to is by saying we're going to raise taxes to pay for this. So I think we want to be very careful that we don't make it a political football funding our pensions.
I think that's a really good point. But I also want to point out what Mr. Martell said earlier, that property tax increases should be considered as a last resort. That was one of the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Committee. And to have property tax levy appear as basically option number 2 isn't kind of congruent with that recommendation.
Well, you have
Even
to,
though I think maybe what you mean here is up to 90%, it would not necessarily impose an increase,
correct.
but I think we can maybe just be a little bit more clear
Okay.
about that.
And maybe we can work on some language to say that is the last resort, and we need to decide, if you get to the day where your choice is between an incremental revenue source like a property tax increase, or staying on the path and funding the pension at 100%, which do we say the city should do? I think this group would say we should make the contribution, even if it requires some degree of tax increase. But I would also say that's the council member's decision.
I mean, I think
you
it'll be
know?
incumbent upon our city council to explain to the public that this is actually something that's going to reduce your taxes ultimately, rather than,
So let's work on the language of what are the priorities going down to that last resort, and what would we recommend happens in that eventuality. We're sitting here now, because of a lot of reasons we talked about earlier, at a very healthy reserve number. So likely, we're going to get through several years before we would get to that decision point of there are no remaining excess reserves. What do we do?
Right, but that's
Let's
why.
think about that now.
Okay,
and
and I
make a
also think
decision
that
now.
that fifth point there is so important, because let's say we came to the year end and, hey, everybody, we've got 23 million in surplus. I would hope that every year going forward, when we end the year with this kind of surplus, we would have that debate at the dais as to whether or not we want to net fund at 105 this year. So, I mean, I think that's really important, that be, again, we're not locking into it, but that should be something that we're recommending.
Oh, I have 3 really quick points. One is, I went to Claire's session, the education, and I would love to do a community education and bring, I think you spoke, and Foster, because, like you just said, David, if we fund now, that'll be a less burden later on. I also did look at the ISB, I found that, and they earned 8.3 the last 10 years, 7.3 the last 5 years, and 7.2 the last 3 years. Granted, it was a very good stock market, but interest rates are up now. So I do think a 6.25, 6.5 is probably in the range. And thirdly, just because I did work on the investment policy for a long time with ISB, you don't want to be too constricted with the policy. We want to have enough in the policy that decisions can be made, but you don't want to make it so tight that if there's a variance, people will feel that they're not going against the policy. So I think we need to have language like the last resort. We can't say never raising property taxes, language like that. We have to have a little flexibility, but I think once we do the education, it would be very good. And maybe even we have like a little book or a little education piece, because this is a big part, and all people hear about is the state budget and the school pension plans in the city, and people get very worried. So,
Can I recommend that perhaps over the next couple of weeks, that Sherry and I take a stab at amending that Foster and Foster provided funding policy, and we circulate it appropriately and take in people's thoughts. But I think that, what is the key here? What's the priority for funding, right? And because I guess, I don't think we have any big differences on any other point in this group. So, okay.
And I love those ideas, Sherry. I think it would be great if we also considered, after our next meeting, hosting, like the Finance and Budget Committee hosting an educational session, like a sort of for the public. I think that would.
yeah, I mean, it was eye-opening for me, and I think the public would really appreciate it.
when do you anticipate we will have a finished package and we're going to council with our recommendations? Is that the next
You
meeting?
think we'll bring
or-
it back next month?
I think we could have a package next month. It would be a question of, and I think this is for the council members, do we want to invite comment on that draft that we would then maybe take in and amend further and vote on in July? Or if we're comfortable enough with the draft, maybe we could vote on it in June? I certainly want to move on to other things,
Yeah,
but this is our biggest issue. And if we could truly put this away, it would be very fundamental. And then we've got capital projects and all sorts of other stuff we would love to get to.
I would suggest, preparing a draft at the committee level, sharing that draft for public comment, making any revisions that we want to make based on that comment, and then that recommendation goes to council with the stakeholder engagement already having been done.
So do you think, before we do public comment, should this committee approve it first and then public?
I think we release a draft.
After July, after we come together?
At our next meeting.
Okay.
I think if we
So
can
we can
target,
discuss
target
it.
June to release a draft, then schedule a public meeting, educational session, have it posted on the website for public comment, and then I guess July, we would approve the final version.
And in coordinates with that, Hitesh, we need some legal opinion too about exactly the PPRT and things like that, because I think we want to put that in the policy.
I've been on the phone with David Harris. He's the director of the Illinois Department of Revenue. And I just want to say, like, all the documents, it's in the statute. We can all read the statute. It's, even he was like, I filled him in on some information like about the Commerce Department. So I would just say it is all right here. I don't think, and I'm happy to share the link to the statute, the state statutes. I just don't think we need a whole bunch of back and forth on.
And ultimately, it all comes out of the general fund, right? That's where the money's going to, come from. And to your point, a sustained path that we stick to fully fund this is what is going to make the debt rating agencies happy. But we're doing it for the right reasons. We're doing it to ultimately drop the required funding, the required contributions, because we are fully funded. So, is there anything else for this evening? Okay, with that, I will say we are adjourned.